Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. In this episode, we hope to help you thrive in life and leadership. And I want to tell you about two things before we dive in. First of all, how is your team culture? You know, my friends at Leader have an assessment for you to really tell whether your employees are engaged or not. You can check it out at leader.com/culture. That's leadr.com/culture. Just click the link. And I've got something for you called the Preaching Cheat Sheet. I've been communicating, preaching, giving keynote talks for over 30 years. And there's a hard way to do it and an easy way to do it. And I can't do the hard work of coming up with great content, but I can show you how to do it better, faster, and far more efficiently so that you can really focus on what matters. I've got 10 steps inside the cheat sheet that will help you get to a great talk faster starting right now. You can just click on the link or go to preachingcheatsheet.com. That's preachingcheatsheet.com. And now to today's episode. JD, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Carey, for having me. Love your stuff.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate what you're doing. And I want to start with change. So you've been leading Summit Church for just over 20 years now, which is incredible. That's good longevity these days in church world, JD, I would say, right? When you read all the polls. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges facing church leaders today?
Well, I mean, being very familiar with the podcast, Carey, I think you have a lot of guests on here that kind of trumpet some of the same themes, and I would agree with
Go ahead and
most
echo.
of what I hear on here. I mean, we also obviously have a rapidly secularizing culture, so that the assumptions that you make, I mean, literally just 5, 6, 7 years ago are fundamentally different. I found that when it comes to certain parts of the Christian message, the more difficult, challenging things, it used to be kind of a like don't ask, don't tell type of approach. Like I won't bring it up if you don't bring it up. And now it's just because there's so much of a narrative that has been given, whether it's by the media or by entertainment. I actually realized that with most people who are unchurched, I'm starting not on neutral ground. I'm starting at quite the deficit. And I've got to say, hey, look, you've heard that these are the options. You've heard this is what we believe. This is actually what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to speak with grace and truth. And so I think that's being aware of those dynamics and the assumptions that people in our community make when they step foot inside a church. I think that's a change that it has occurred just in, I mean, I don't consider myself that old in ministry, but that's been a change that's occurred over my 20 years or so that's been there.
Well, what's interesting, I want to go back to some of the other ones, but you're in the South. I mean, you're in the Bible Belt. Like you're there. So how is it showing up? Is it showing up demographically? Is it showing up in younger generations, all generations? Like where are you detecting it?
Yeah, good question. Just to be clear, we're in Raleigh, Durham, which is where UNC, Chapel Hill, Duke University, a lot of, and so we kind of think of ourselves as like the hole in the Bible Belt, where the buckle goes.
So I get it.
Yeah, I mean, like just it's like 80% of our community votes Democratic, and that's just not typical for a lot of your kind of South. So we're in a very blue area. But having said that, you've got it definitely is that younger generation that assumes that, but really even just I'd say all generations, there's sort of a cultural zeitgeist at the moment, and there's some assumptions. We used to have Christians may be a little strict on some things, but they're good people, they're loving people, they're honest people. I just don't, my perception is I don't enter conversations with that benefit anymore. I enter as somebody that is like almost outside of the Overton window, where the set of things that you're allowed to disagree about, that they automatically put us outside of that window. And we've got to overcome that with whether it's grace or giving reasonable explanations. I just think being aware of that's very helpful. And otherwise, if you're naive about it, it ends up you end up just making it worse.
So you see that. What else are you seeing in terms of change?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we just the rapid decline in things like attention span and how people intake information. I think sometimes we as believers probably too quickly try to adapt but I definitely see that the focus on how everything as it's gone digital and online, it's presented some real challenges to doing the one another parts of the body of Christ, and to really be to be a church. And we've struggled to try to adapt to that change, and also remain faithful to what it means to be a genuine local church.
Where's that showing up for you, the shorter attention span?
Well, not so much in where you think like just the sermons. I mean, that's obviously something. I mean, we find that, people actually end up having a decent appetite for that, but, just finding how willing people are to skip engagement in, the body of Christ. Yeah. They just, the COVID, we tried to be on the cutting edge of, changing our online strategy. And I think those advances are really, really helpful. I think that season, the lockdown forced us to get 10 years ahead. And, overall that was a positive development. But there was just there was a lot of people that instead of, coming 2 to 3 times a month, they would come 1 to 2 times a month. And sometimes they just go long stretches. And I'm not, somebody who thinks that you can't, carry out the body of Christ and be a part of, some of these online experiences. But I also know that there definitely is an in-personness to these relationships. And I often will say to our church, like, look, when my wife and I are apart and, I'm traveling, I'll FaceTime her. And we have a great time. I'm so thankful for that. But if I'm FaceTiming her and she's in the next room at home every night, then that means that there might be a challenge to our relationship. And so we see people really just, everything has become, I sit at home on my couch and we're seeing this just kind of rapid isolation of atomization, I think is the word I've heard a lot, just of people. And it's showing up not just in spiritual and religious context. It shows up in how people are, engaging with the opposite sex and how they, form friendships. It's just every metric is kind of down. And I think that certainly affected the church too.
Right. I'm curious about you as a leader, because one of the things I was tracking even as recently as today is I've found, and it could be I've come off like a month long of having a cold or whatever, but I've seen this trend generally. My own attention span is not what it used to be. I'm reading a book for the purposes of endorsing it, and I'm like, okay, I think I got like 20 pages in me right now, and that's about it. And I don't know, there's an atomization, I like that term, of my own attention span. Have you noticed anything internal like that, or you're just like hyper disciplined and you haven't noticed a change?
Well, now that you phrase it that way, I'm thinking, man, have I gotten like that? I mean, some of it, honestly, I'm turning 50 next year. So there's all these changes that are happening in every part of my, energy. And so I need to reflect on that, Carey. I need to say, is that because I'm getting older? Is that because the media is changing my attention span? But I still enjoy reading and that type of stuff. For me, it's always been like a muscle that the moment I stop using it, I quickly get out of shape.
Yeah.
And I'll get back into it. And if I've gone through a couple seasons where I didn't read as much as I would like to, and then getting back into it, it's like, all right, a 20-minute spot and I'm enough. And then it gradually gets longer.
Fair enough. Well, your church has really focused on reaching the next gen. We touched on it briefly, but what are some trends you're seeing among the next generation, or even innovations that you are working on to better connect with younger millennials and Gen Z?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've never really thought of our church as that innovative, meaning, I don't know, just that's been a tool that we've tried to use to access people, but it's never been what we really led with. When I look and I see, because there are certain things I'll kind of in retrospect see like, hey, that was actually a really good adaptation for reaching people. They were really done, with that kind of as a second thought. I think of that, what C.S. Lewis said, that, he never really tried to be original. He just tried to state the old doctrines as plainly as possible for, British people in the 1950s. And somehow that came off as really novel. And so, when I think about how we've reached this next generation, I'm like, well, I just feel like we tried to make it as plain as possible to them. And that made us stumble into innovations. I mean this to be as ridiculous as it sounds, but I thought we kind of invented multi-site. which is not at all true. I mean, not even by a decade.
Sure.
I wasn't aware, but I thought, oh, we could do this. We could put this here and we could there. And then come to find out as I start, investigating it, like a lot of people have been doing this for a long time and they've been really effective at it. But it's just an example of how, like, okay, is it easier rather than building one big gargantuan, Six Flags Over Jesus kind of building and having people drive 40 minutes to it? How can we tell people to stay where they are, serve where they live and be the church in that community? Right. We are very, I like to think of us as a very plain church. We have, worship, prayer, and somebody stands up, opens the Bible and just tries to say this is what it means and this is how it changes your life. I find that especially for college students, there is a high desire to see, like, what does, the way I say it is, I just got to give them the whole ball of crazy up front. I'm not trying to show there's 3 things that make your life better. It's just, this is what I want to teach through the scope of Scripture and show how there's a completely different approach to life and reality and a completely different story that's being told. And so I don't feel like that's that innovative. It's just, kind of what it is. And it's connected with a lot of, I think, very hungry young professionals and students here. And by God's grace, we've seen a lot of people profess faith in Christ.
Well, I think if there's one thing I've seen emerging as a trend with Gen Z in particular, it's stripped down, it's hope over hype, it's simple, clear, direct, personal, that seems to be resonating. Now, last time you were on, you shared a vision to plant 1,000 churches by 2050. So you got a few decades left. You were at about, I think, 300 or so. And then we had a global pandemic shut down. All the craziness sort of intervened since then. What's changed in that vision, if anything? And how is that progressing or advancing at this point, JD?
Yeah, I appreciate you remember that. So we're on number 511. Wow. So it's progressing. When I first got here, in fact, I was just talking to one of our campus pastors who's been here for about a decade. And he said, when I first came in and heard that 1,000 churches vision, he said, I thought that was huge and insurmountable. He said, but now it just feels like, if anything, because of the power of multiplication and because of just how the church grows, he says it's pretty clear that's going to be too small of a goal. He's actually leaving as one of our campus pastors to go and plant. He's taken a couple dozen of our people to go plant a church over in a part of Southeast Asia, in one of the big cities over there. And he said it's just as we've seen kind of that slow process of multiplication, where churches plant churches. And when every church is planted with the view of multiplication in mind, it happens quicker than you think it will. And that's I read this book recently, or it's actually an older book, but it's by Rodney Stark, the church historian. He actually passed away a few years ago. He was at Baylor. But in one of his books, I think it was The Rise of Christianity, he says that, he said, from our best estimates, the total number of Christians that were in the world and at the end of the first century, 99 AD, he said it's about 7,500. Wow. Which, I don't know, you think like, okay, let's give him 1,000 on either side for him to be off. That's not that many. After all the apostles are dead and passed on, there's less Christians total in the world than there are, at less than many of the churches, that gather every Sunday just right here in our own city.
Less than a hockey arena, let alone a football stadium.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you think that, by the time you get to the end of the first century or into the second century, Tertullian describes the church as geographically broad, but still numerically insignificant. And then by the time you get to 312 AD, those Roman historians are saying there's so many Christians, it's like, more than 50% of the Roman Empire. We're talking millions and millions and millions. And Rodney Stark says, how did that happen? He said, where you go from, 7,500 Christians in 99 AD to where more than half the Roman Empire is that way in 312 AD. And he gives several factors that were at play, but the one that really stood out to me is he said, it really is just the mathematical principles of multiplication. And it takes a little bit of time for them to kick in, but then you really just see it multiply. And I think of that based on our context here, because in the last, 100 years or so, Carey, we've had bigger churches in America than the apostles would ever have dreamed of.
Yeah.
You know, Billy Graham has preached to larger audiences, and I'm all for that. I'm not a mega church hater, obviously, and I love, large evangelistic events. But during that time that we've seen bigger audiences than the apostles ever dreamed of, we've seen the percentage of Americans in church every weekend, we've seen that number go down, not up. And so when we think about it from that perspective, you're like, okay, I'm not anti-mega church, but is it possible that all this stuff that we're thinking will grow the church is not actually what grows the church, and what grows it are what they were doing in those first, second, and third centuries? And Rodney Stark, he basically says it this way. He says, what they had that we don't have anymore is this awareness that every Christian was called to multiply and every church was called to plant other churches. And he said that did more than all the other things, that we have today that they didn't have. And that's what I think explains what's happened with us with that vision of 1,000 churches. Is it's just we're seeing these powers of multiplication. I think we'll cross 1,000 within 5 years, and then maybe that number needs to be 10,000.
Revisit that goal
by 2050. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's break that down a little bit, because I think we talked about it. We touched on it briefly the last time you were on with Todd Wilson, but I really want to break it down, because I think the instinctive reaction for a lot of pastors, because most churches are struggling, or even churches that are thriving right now, is I'll give you a couple of scenarios. One pastor says, okay, we're growing, but we're small. And if I give away my best people, I'm going to have nobody left. And then there's another church, let's say they're close to breaking 1,000 and they've clawed back from the pandemic and they're exhausted and now they got a full room again. But they're like, wait. Here's what you don't understand, JD. It took me so many years to get here. I'm just afraid of losing people, and then we got to start over again. If we get rid of our best leaders, where are those other leaders going to come from? I mean, this is something you have been through numerous times with your own locations and with sending people out around the world. Last time we talked, there was someone else you planted, and I think they beat you on the outreach list or whatever, the outreach 100 list or something like that. So you've dealt with that, and you probably had those internal fears, concerns, worries yourself. So what would you say to those church leaders who are like, we can't afford to multiply?
Yeah, well, first of all, I feel that. And just so we put all the cards on the table, the kind of people that step up and volunteer to go on church plants are never sideline people. They don't say, hey, I'm disengaged from the mission here, but I'm ready to go on a church plant.
I wasn't giving much. I wasn't serving, but I'm going to go lead.
But I'm going to be radically generous now and move. Right.
These are your best people.
No transformation by aviation. But, because of that, we've had to say goodbye. Sometimes we'll joke that being in our church feels like trying to hug a parade sometimes, because like by the time I get to know somebody, they leave. But what we found is that there is, it really is, there's a thing called the heresy of sequentialism. It actually, I first heard it from a guy named David Garrison, who was one of the most prolific church planners over in Asia. And he said that, Americans in particular commit this heresy of sequentialism by treating the Christian life as if you kind of go 101, 201, 301, 401, and then multiplication, sharing Christ. He said, that's all, that's your 401 level. He said, you look at the New Testament and you find that Jesus put the reproduction and the multiplication down at the first level. So it's go home and tell your friends how great things the Lord has done for you. The woman in John 4, she immediately goes out and begins to bring people back. And so, we say that for a church, it's like, yes, you can't afford to wait until, you're at 2,000 people and you've got, at least what you think now at this state, you think, at 2,000, we're going to have all this excess money and stuff and we're going to be ready to give it away. And you say you got to build that in from the beginning, because it's part of it. It actually creates healthy discipleship. It creates the right leadership dynamics. And so we just, from the beginning just said, look, we're going to give away more than we think we can. What's ironic, Carey, is we as pastors, for pastors that are listening, we all know how to teach this to our people regarding money. No pastor ever says, right? Like, hey, if you got excess money sitting around in your bank account, you should give that away. You give God your first and your best. And then what you find, and this is true, is he really does multiply it. He multiplies your provisions back to you. Why would we say that with our money and not do that with our leadership? We give to God the first and the best of our leadership. And I'm just telling you, you cannot outgive God. I feel like for every one we send out, there's 3 more that pop up in their place. And I think there are both natural and supernatural reasons for that. You know, the supernatural reasons are God just multiplies it because like he does the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. But the natural reasons are, several secular leadership people have pointed this out. Liz Wiseman wrote that book, Multipliers. And she talks about the leaders that attract other leaders are those that demonstrate with their organization that they are committed not to having people as cogs in their machine, but you're committed to their development. And that means when it's time for them to step outside of your organization and go, that they see you blessing them and sending them. And that creates this magnet for other leaders who want to be in that kind of environment. She uses Jack Welch as an example, because I think in his heyday at GE, that you could look out across the Fortune 500 companies, and there was this absurd number of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who had come off of Jack Welch's staff.
Right.
And she says, now you might be tempted to look at that and say, oh, well, he couldn't keep good talent. But she said, it's actually the opposite. It's that because he was committed to, when it was time, sending those men and women out, it created this desire of people. You fought to get on Jack Welch's staff because you knew that you were going to be developed, and that includes sending out. And so that's what I would say to that pastor of the small church or the church of 1,000. Like, yeah, I understand you feel like you can't afford to give it away, but in a kingdom sense, you can't afford not to.
So is this something you have to tell yourself again and again to remind yourself? Or is this like, do you have to have an internal narrative every time it's time to start a new location, send someone off, plant church number 512 or whatever number you're at right now? Like, is this, do you win this battle, or is it a constant tension? I think is my question, JD.
It's literally happening right now, Carey, as we're having this conversation.
Okay.
I'm self-reminding. Earlier today, when I sat with this campus pastor, it was a larger meeting of all of our campus pastors, and I'm hearing this guy talk to me about who he's got on his team. I felt it again. I'm like, oh, not that person. And I mean, he's taken, it's like big givers and really talented people. And I just have to say, okay, this is not my church. And the worst possible thing that I can do for this church, or even for my own soul, is to close my selfish, cold hands around this and say, this is mine. And everything in my flesh, Carey, everything, just wants to hold on. Cause I got into ministry for mostly godly reasons, but I think you and I've talked about this before. Ministry ends up being a great place for people with the idol of success to hide, because you cloak everything that you are doing as doing it for Jesus when it's actually, for you. And I fight that. That is the death to my flesh. Is I feel like I never graduated from that, and I don't suppose I ever will.
That was actually later down in my question, so I want to lift that up. Ministry is a great place for guys with the idol of success to hide, because you can cloak all your ambition in spiritual language. It's like, oh, I did this all for God, when really it's been a lot about me. I'm turning 58 this week, and I think about motives more than any time I ever have in my life. And I don't think I score well in that, to be honest with you. Like, I don't know that I'm succeeding in that area. I want to talk about why, and that's another thing that I'm very sensitive to these days, is just people using spiritual language around selfish ambition. Just really gets my radar going. Talk about how you came up to that insight. Like, how did you stumble on that? And then how does that play out, that this becomes a great place to hide in the church for selfish ambition?
I think it was St. Augustine who said that emotions like anxiety and fear and worry and jealousy, that they're like smoke that are coming from a fire. And when you see the smoke, you should trace the trail of smoke back to the fire. The worst thing to do is just wave the smoke away, because he said these fires are idols that you're worshiping at, and these emotions are the sign. So for me, it was fairly early on in my ministry, 4 or 5 years into it. I just really, I just dealt with some pretty severe jealousy of other people. Nothing that got to the point that I was like, like vandalizing their churches, but just, but it was
me.
like, why, right? Like, why wasn't I invited to speak at that conference? Why did they get that? And it's hard to even verbalize this, admit it, but you delight in somebody's failure, where you hear something that happens. And I remember just having this one day where it was like this, like, what is wrong with your heart? Because now this guy has destroyed his family, because of failure. He's hurt all these people's faith. And your first emotion was kind of all right, now I don't have to worry about that guy. And it feels like, I imagine some of your listeners are like, I'm not sure this guy should be in ministry, but I'm just telling you, that was what was in my heart.
Just being honest, I was like, I've had those thoughts too. Yep.
Yeah. Like, why is that? And it came to a head really one afternoon. I'd set aside a day for prayer and fasting and trying to ask God, like, would you send a revival to Raleigh, Durham? Just the kind that would that they in 100 years from now, they'd write about it. And I don't have a whole lot of times where I feel like, God's not speaking to me every day and, writing things in the sky and, speaking of my alphabet soup or whatever. But it was one of those moments where God spoke really, really clearly, as loud as if it had been audible. And what the Holy Spirit said was like, all right, what if I say yes to that prayer? And what if I send a revival to the Triangle, the Raleigh-Durham area, the kind that will change the landscape of the city? But what if your church doesn't get any bigger? And what if I do the church down the road? What if their church gets bigger and their pastor gets famous and you never get a mention in the history books? Do you still want me to do it? Now, Carey, I know the right answer. I know the right, yes, Lord, you must increase and I must decrease. I know that's the answer, but that wouldn't have been the real answer. It was like, I'm not okay with that, because somehow in this, thy kingdom come, right behind that has always been my kingdom come. And, I feel like it makes a better story if, on that day I wrote something down and lit a fire and buried it, and I've never struggled with it again. But really that just started a process of, repentance, a posture I still find myself in today. I think Martin Luther, how he always said the whole of the Christian life is a posture of repentance. And that's, I will still feel, now maybe not to the same degree. I do think there's been some progress in grace, but I still feel some of those things. And I have to say, okay, what is this? Who is this for? And whose name is this about? And died in my flesh all over again. Paul Tripp told me recently, Paul Tripp, he's the Christian counselor. And I was just asking him about these guys, men and women who just have these spectacular failures. And you've certainly talked about them here in your podcast, but I just said, what do these guys have in common? What do these men and women have in common? Because he's known, some of them up close. And he said, he said, there's two things I see. He said, number one is, he said, they begin to lack peer community. He said, I don't mean community because these people are usually extroverts. So they always have people around them. He said, but I mean the kind of people that are they're not impressed with you. They don't work for you and they will tell you the truth. Yeah. He said, that's number one. He said, number two is, and this compounds the first one, is he says, they forget the power of indwelling sin. He said, they think that they've learned enough and been successful enough that they no longer have to fight that battle they used to fight in their earliest days of Christianity, which is just dying to the flesh. And he said, because of that, you add that to the first one, and then it just grows into this monster that they don't even know is really there. I mean, the Apostle Paul in Romans 7 is just like, I'm convinced in my flesh as an apostle, there's nothing good there. And I wrestle with this and I hate it. And when God is being gracious to me and when I've got the right friendships in my life, I can still see that same proud kid that was, so concerned with who the cheerleaders were looking at when he was out on the basketball court. There's a version of that guy that stands up in the pulpit every week. And I have to, just maintain a posture of repentance and say, Lord, I need this to be about your glory and not mine. Help me to actually believe that with my heart.
I really appreciate you talking about that. And I think, when I look at you planting ahead of schedule, you've got this big vision, right? That by 2050, you're going to have 1,000 churches. You're ahead of it and you keep releasing. I think that's a great mark of leadership, because the other thing would be is to let the voices, the fears, the insecurities win and say, well, we're going to slow down a little bit. Like we've got 30, 27 years, we can, slow down a little bit. We'll do most of them in the 2040s. In the meantime, I'm going to hang on to my top donors. I'm going to hang on to it. Does it create that dynamic? Do you ever get people, tapping you on the shoulder, knocking on your door going, we're giving away our best stuff here. What are you doing? Like, what kind of strategy? Or is that more of an internal battle? Like, do you get your team? Do you exhaust your leadership team going, now I got to recruit for Kidsmen again, and now I got to recruit for worship leaders, which apparently is now trademarked. But anyway, never mind. I don't really saw that article.
That's right.
I owe somebody money. So, does your team get exhausted by it sometimes?
Yeah, and just to be transparent, because I don't want to create any unrealistic expectations. Anybody listening, I mean, there are healthy ways to do it, and there are unhealthy ways. The same way, if somebody comes to you and says, "I really want to give to the gospel," I'm giving away my entire paycheck. You're like, well, you need to make sure you feed your family. So we've had to, learn to create certain guidelines. When we have a planter that leaves our staff, which we have usually 2 to 3 a year that will go out, or 1 to 2 a year for that'll off of our staff, a major staff member that will leave. We try to say there are healthy ways and unhealthy ways to do this, some of which are not sustainable. Give you a real practical example. Our church has been historically a white church. Over the last several years, by God's grace, we've really grown in ethnic diversity. And part of that has been the cultivation of certain leaders of color who are they are killing it on our staff. Well, when somebody leaves to plant a church, they think, well, I want to plant a multi-ethnic church, so I'm going to take that guy or that girl. And certainly they're free to go if that's what God's calling them to do, but it's a little bit too low-hanging fruit to say, hey, that's something that is being cultivated, so you need to begin to form relationships like that on your own. That would be an example. A second example is we say that like a campus pastor, because that for us they are the first line of pastoral ministry. Right. And if we know somebody is thinking about going out and planting, we just say, that's not the role for you. It's better for you to be an associate at the campus, because it's just too chaotic for our church to say, okay, here's my pastor, and then every 3 years I've got to switch to a new one. So there's some best practices, and I just want to be clear, because I don't want somebody to think that we just, empty out our executive team every 2 to 3 years. But having said that, it does get. We just had a conversation today about a couple of staff members, because our church planting pastor just really challenged me. He said, I feel like it's time. And I was like, not them. We gotta hang on to them. And he said, no, I think it's time. And he was right. And so, yeah, that was hard. It's going to be hard for all the people that I had to send them. What's even worse is I'm the one that sends them the letter that just says, I'm not only am I blessing you in this quest, I'm actually encouraging you to consider whether God might be calling you to this, because we see in you the qualities that could make for a successful planner. And that's hard for me, and it's hard for the staff, around them. But we know, as long as the Holy Spirit is at work and we're keeping the vision in front, over time, after the Band-Aid's been ripped off, you kind of say, yeah, look at what I was just in a church this past weekend that took a few of our most beloved people, and man, they're reaching so many people now in this city that I stood up there and I'm like, okay, this is definitely worth it. I miss that guy. I miss serving with him, but this, and what's heaven going to be like when we see the fruit of all that?
So before we move on, I want to talk a little more about multiplication, because we talked about this a little bit with Todd last time, but there's addition, subtraction, stagnation, I guess, and then multiplication. So I want you to think through, and I think Stark's observations that you talk about, that the only explanation to go from 7,500 to half the Roman Empire in 2 centuries was basically the path of multiplication. But multiplication seems to it feels like subtraction when you're the sending church, right? But it's not. There is a regenerative. It's not like your original campus is down to the last 18 people. You've been very, very strong in that respect. Your campuses are staffed. Everything seems to grow. There seems to be compounding, multiplying impact there. Can you explain a little bit more for people who would be suspect or afraid or worried if they embrace that, how multiplication seems to really increase everything?
Yeah. Well, Peter Drucker, the the leadership guy, the guru, used to always say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's one of his most famous statements. And, it's a mistake to say, okay, I'm just going to take this strategy and lay it on top of a church and think that it's going to work and be healthy for the church. That, what we are seeing now is honestly the result of a decade or so of building that culture to now that's flowering in some of these things. I think that culture, once it begins to pervade from top to bottom, people begin to see that, yes, it's movement and it provides excitement, and it's something that I really want to be a part of. I just a few weeks ago had lunch with one of our campus elders that has been he's not on staff, but he's campus elder. He's been leading a small group for 11 years. He said, I've been leading the small group for 11 years. And I said, oh, that's amazing. He said, we have 10 people in it right now. He said, over the 11 years, we've had 150 people in that small group. And I kind of looked at him, sideways, and he said, yeah, he said, my wife and I keep very detailed records of all the people in this small group. He said, of the 150 that have been in our small group, 10 are in now. He said, one of that 150 just stopped coming to small group, stopped coming to church. He said, the other 139 have been sent out from our small group either to be a part of a church plant or to plant another small group. And his kind of like excitement over being able to see and be a part of that is, I hate to use the term lowest level, but at the lowest level of a small group, when you're seeing that kind of excitement that comes out of multiplication, that creates a culture that makes it a lot easier for a church to do that. We do fight, as a big mega church, we fight the country club thing, and people, I fight it, just what's it like to be comfortable. But nothing, when the Spirit of God is moving among a people, nothing brings joy quite as much as seeing and hearing reports of people coming to Christ and seeing the gospel go forward. So if it's left up to my leadership, and I hope this doesn't sound like false humility, I will, the direction of my heart will take it toward country club. But, as God is gracious to us and keeping the Great Commission in front of us, and as the church believes that and we hold each other accountable, I think it's sustainable, and I hope it's something we can do till I'm either dead or retired.
So you wear a few hats, and for a few years, you were president of the Southern Baptist Convention.
That hat.
Easy years. I think you didn't have a lot of challenges during your presidency.
No, that's right. Yeah. Those 3 years were the longest 30 years of my life.
So let's go there. Let's talk about some of the challenges of leading Southern Baptists through this unbelievably difficult season. And you can take that wherever you'd like, JD.
Yeah, well, one of the things that really defined the presidency was, our response to sexual abuse stuff that was happening.
Yeah.
It was really by God's grace. When I became president, I was aware that there was some things we were hearing that were just not, that were concerning. And so I launched this task force. It's about 6 months after that this kind of article comes out in the Houston Chronicle that just, details, hey, there's some things that are not being reported properly. Now, let me be clear. The vast majority, there's 46,000 Southern Baptist churches. When I say the vast majority, I mean the vast majority they're just faithful pastors and leaders that love their people and are mortified at the thought of something like this happening. And they're not trying to protect people in power, but there was enough there that, it was heartbreaking to hear some of these stories. And, certainly that's not the kind of thing you're ever, you check off and keep, and move on from. But I think there's been a national conversation, even larger than the SBC, that's been really, really good to say there's a tendency for people in power to protect other people in power.
Yep.
And of all people, Carey, we should have known that, because Jesus says, into the flock, wolves are going to come and the wolves are going to try to devour the flock. And we should have known that we needed better safeguards to make sure that those wolves would not be protected or sheltered or be able to hide. So that was one thing. I feel like that's a hard thing just to say and then say, and number two. A second thing was we've been through some pretty tumultuous.
Before you go to number two, though, because I'm sure and again, say to the extent that you're comfortable, there must have been, if there was and I think back to I don't want to name names, but one of my earliest experiences when I was a seminary student, was a pastor who ended up in an inappropriate sexual relationship with someone he was counseling. And I watched this happen when I'm like in my 20s. And I remember the action my denominational leader took was, okay, we won't really deal with this. We'll just remove this pastor and put him somewhere on one of the coasts where hopefully he gets the writing on the wall and starts over again. And I remember being incensed by that. And, young, not even ordained guy goes up and challenges the regional governing guy who made the decision. And I'm like, how could you possibly do that? And he just said, well, one day you'll understand. I still don't understand. I don't get it. It's wrong. Did you get, there must have been pressure to keep it covered up, or there must have been pressure to protect the people involved. How did you counter that or deal with that? Or did people kind of realize, no, this is a different age and we gotta take responsibility?
It's still, and just to be transparent, some of these questions, they get a little complex, because it's cloaked in things that feel like Christian virtues sometimes. Let me explain what I mean.
We have to protect the church.
Yeah, that's right. We know that there are people who would like to discredit and smear the church, and that certainly is a lot of motive. And you don't want to play into their hands. And are they the ones setting the agenda? Then you've got this concept of grace, and when we love grace, and God can forgive and restore, and we love to see people restored. And so you think, well, so and so did this, but they seem to me to be pretty sorry. Let's put them back in leadership as a celebration of God's grace. And listen, I believe in God's grace and I believe in his power, but there are certain sins that once you commit them, if you use your power as a pastor to sin, then yes, you can be forgiven, but because of what it does to the victims, the people you sinned against, you can never again be in a position of power like that. I mean, and so people, they didn't understand that. They thought they were actually highlighting grace when they were perpetuating people that were able to abuse. The concept of the benefit of the doubt. I mean, that's something we cherish as Christians. I want to, Carey, for you, I want to give you the benefit of the doubt. If somebody says something about you, I want to say, well, I know Carey, I'm going to give him, I'm going to wait till that's proven. That's a good concept. But the flip side of that is, well, what about the person who is making the accusation? They kind of need the benefit of the doubt too.
Yeah.
And so how do I take an accusation against somebody that I like and want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but also give this, in many cases, a woman who is coming forward very broken, and say, how do I honor her with the same, if not more, honor that I'm trying to give to my, other person in leadership. There was a guy who spoke, I'm going to say it was prophetic. You are talking to a Southern Baptist, so,
Yeah, you got to be careful with that. Yeah.
I'm still going to say it's prophetic. He just, at the beginning of this process, he said, you're going to make mistakes. He said, but err on the side of the victim, not the institution. And I think that was prophetic, because I don't think we don't want to make any mistakes. And we certainly don't say, people are guilty before, proven guilty. But I just, you want to say, we want to be a safe place, and we want to recognize that, statistically, this is happening, and this needs to be a place that people can come as a refuge. That's part of what it means to represent the gospel.
Thank you. No, I appreciate you sharing on that. So, I mean, this isn't an exhaustive treatment of that, but there was that issue when you were president. Right. You were moving on to number 2. What were some of the other challenges that you were dealing with?
Well, that we went through, obviously, the COVID stuff, George Floyd. That was and I've heard you talk about it on your podcast wonderfully with several guests, but that was a very challenging time for everybody. Yeah. And what became apparent, just first of all, in my own church, was that a lot of the unity that we had experienced, it was not really battle tested. It's kind of like, a ship. You don't really know how strong it is till it goes through a hurricane. And there were a lot of things that we assumed we were together on that suddenly that year just revealed these cracks and fissures. And it was, like many pastors, I was like, am I going to be able to keep this thing together? I lost friends that, walked with them through tragedy and married their kids, and they're leaving because I said too much about George Floyd. I didn't say enough about George Floyd. We took off the mask too quickly. We didn't, wear them long enough. Whatever it was, and it became apparent that for a lot of people, their first identification was more political than it was in the body of Christ. I'm not an apolitical guy. I think we ought to carry our Christian worldview into every discussion, but I know as a church and as the body of Christ, it's like I've got a unity that supersedes and allows for some disagreement in those things. And it just became apparent that was not true for a lot of people, that they could not be unified with somebody that did not, think with uniformity on a lot of those issues. It was almost ironic because we Christians rail against cancel culture. It was shocking how many people canceled their church because of disagreement over one. And I just was like, I don't understand this. That was painful. And then, so you take that from a local church now and you extrapolate it out to the SBC. And there was, as a whole, there was a lot of tension and, just trying to say, what's the basis of our unity really about? And are we gospel Great Commission people? The good news is, and, I hope you won't hear this as any kind of like positive spin, but I always felt like there were two Southern Baptist conventions. There was the Twitter Southern Baptist Convention, and then there was the real Southern Baptist Convention. And I would, be on social media, and I'd be going to some of these. I think some of these more like, rural kind of country type of, we're just talking the red state, deep red state. SBC. And I would think, okay, I'm going into there, and based on what I see on social media, I'm not going to be well received because, they really want us to be culture warriors based on social media. I would get there and I would find that it was a bunch of pastors who loved me, loved each other. They're just trying to reach people for Christ. And it was like this little group was so loud that they dominated the airwaves, that it obscured the vast majority of people who really, weren't. They just loved Jesus and loved people, wanted to complete the Great Commission. It sort of felt like, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but it's sort of like, the Wizard of Oz scene where, the big old voice and they pull back the curtain and you're like, wait, it's just that little old man. Like, how was that guy making all that noise? And that's sort of what it felt like. I even feel now like when people, and I understand when people, they kind of see just what certain leaders and people say, then I'll identify with the SBC. I'm like, look, I recognize that at least for me, when I got elected as president, I felt like it was the vast majority of the people in the pews and pastors, these, 46,000 pastors that wanted our convention to be about the gospel. They wanted it to be about the Great Commission, and not about, ethnic uniformity or political lockstep. And I kept thinking, like, there was several times, Carey, where you're almost like, it's not worth the fight. I just want to, fine, you can have it. I don't need to win this. I'll just go back to my church. And I kept thinking, no, these people are depending on me to stand up to this group, because they're like, we need you to stand here and fight in this and not let those people have this convention, because they don't want their convention to be about that. And sometimes I feel like it's easy for a leader to, get tired of the fight and withdraw, but they're not thinking about the sheep that they're leaving behind, who they're just basically abandoning to the wolves. Because when the wolf is attacking the shepherd and the shepherd says, fine, that's not worth it, and he leaves, then you just leave the flock to the wolves. And so several times I felt, and still feel now, it's like there are a lot of faithful believers in churches that are depending on the right leaders maintaining the conversation and taking it where it needs to go, so that it's not commandeered by people that want to take it a different direction. I mean, the famous statement by Edmund Burke, all that is necessary for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And I'm not trying to say I'm one of the good guys per se. It's just to say that I think leaders you have to be willing to engage in these for the sake of the Great Commission, because leadership is hard, and it's just always going to draw people out who want to take things the other way. And if you got into it because you love accolades and smooth sailing and peace, then I don't know what you were thinking you were going to lead, but it wasn't people.
Your comment about the two SBCs, the Twitter and the Reel, is actually borne out in the research. So I think he's at Duke. I could be wrong. So not that far from you. But Chris Bale, I had him on, I think maybe last year. We'll link to it in the show notes. His book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, makes a very similar claim that something like a single digit, 13% of the tweets or users drive 90% of the extremity online, extreme views, extreme opinions. And I can see how that would happen even in a denomination where the loudest voices may get control, but they're not necessarily representative. And his argument is most people are in the middle. Most people aren't strongly opined one way or the other. They're just sort of, I'm moderately right wing or moderately left wing, or I'm in the middle. But it's the extremes that have hijacked the polarized public discourse that we have. So that seems to be consistent with what you saw in your tour of the SBC during your presidency.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to that, like that extreme group wants that tone to be over the whole conversation. And if you're not willing to adopt that tone, then somehow that means that you're unfaithful. And I always wanted to say, look, like when it comes to, let me just make sure I'm really clear about this. When it comes to unpopular, controversial things that the Bible teaches, my commitment to the sanctity of life, the sanctity of marriage, that God's design for gender and man and woman, and even, core doctrines like, the exclusivity of Christ and the inerrancy of the Bible. Those are things that, yes, I want to be really, really clear on. And if we can't stand together in unity on that, then we might need to go our separate ways. But when it comes to, things like the best way to fix our education system, or, the proper policing techniques, or, any number of the healthcare, global warming, it's like, yes, I actually have very strong opinions on all those subjects we just named. And I think I'm right. If I didn't think I was right, I wouldn't hold those opinions. But I don't believe those ought to define the church. And I just recently, in fact, we were talking right before we started recording. I was thinking about a person who just came to faith in Christ here, who described herself as part of the secular left. Writer for the New York Times and professor at one of our local universities. And I know that if we became identified with a secondary set of political or cultural things, if we become identified by that, then she's never stepping foot in our church. And when I see her and I see how she's come to Christ and how she's growing, and we have hard conversations. We talk about hard truths, but I'm like, she's worth it. She's worth it to say, I'm going to keep the gospel and the central doctrines of Christianity. I'm going to keep those central, keep those, essential. And I'm going to keep secondary things where they belong, which is in secondary conversations. Important and needs to be talked about, but not as part of the identification of the church or the gospel itself.
Yeah, and that's sort of where you're going with your new book, right? Essential Christianity. You're like, there's a few things we really need to talk about, then the rest is sort of secondary. For the average pastor trying to moderate that conversation in his or her church, how do you help them? Because you're always going to have people emailing you, texting you, tapping you on the shoulder going, yeah, but this is essential. Like, what is your opinion on? And they'll start giving you a really hard time. How would you encourage them to tell people, yeah, but this isn't essential? Like, is there a filter you use? How do you navigate that in your own church?
Yeah, so historically, you can kind of look through the history of the church and just see that there are certain things that comprise historic Christian doctrine. There are certain things that are contemporary discussions. There are certain things that are now controversial that didn't used to be controversial. They're new questions that sometimes need very definitive answers to them. We see that in Acts 15, and they came together to try to answer some key questions. One of the I did part of my PhD on the history of doctrine and its development in the church. And part of what you see is that these creeds are written always in context of whatever is controversial at the time. Right. So in our day, questions of gender and marriage, and maybe that wasn't in the Apostles' Creed, but that doesn't mean that it's not essential because it wasn't controversial in 300 AD, but it is controversial now. And so we have to be clear on that. So I don't mean just trying to dumb it down to, 5 statements that everybody can nod their head on. But I do think that as you get into, and you saturate yourself in the New Testament, you find that there are things that are first tier. Then there are things that you just say, man, I really, for the sake of the unity of Christ, I think we can allow disagreement on that, even though your position on that drives me crazy. And I think it's, I think it's wrong. I always love Paul in Romans 14, when he presents the whole meat eating question, right,
which was a big deal back then.
Which was a huge deal. Because, it's like, are you worshiping an idol because you purchased this stuff that had been, and Paul actually pretty clearly reveals his hand in that. He's on team meat eater.
Yeah.
Because he calls them weak. He says, there are people who disagree with me are weak, is essentially, when you read between the lines there. But Paul is like, I'd rather just not press this, though, for the sake of the unity that we need to have around more important things. It's almost like a gospel instinct. And I think that, again, I'm not trying to play prophet or judge here. I think when you peel back some of the layers behind our disunity, it's not that we're too passionate about the things that we're disunifying over. It's that we're not passionate enough about the gospel and the unity of Christ's body. There are reasons why I'm so grieved by that. We have to separate ways, but Jesus prayed in John 17 for this unified church that would present his gospel to the world. And I love that. I love seeing people like my friend that I just told you about come to Christ. And I love seeing people from different ethnicities and different backgrounds have this common salvation. And I'm not willing to put truth on the chopping block for that, but that desire for that thing puts the other stuff into the right categories. And I just wonder when I see some of this, I'm like, it's not that you care too much about that. I don't think you care enough about the gospel or about the flourishing of Christ's body. I know that's judgmental and prophetic, so I'm not talking about anybody in particular, but I think it's a factor.
So the SBC is not the only denomination that's struggling. I mean, you've got...
We're the only ones going to heaven, though.
Oh, yeah, there you go. That's right. I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that publicly. There's a bunch of them. And what do you see as some of the keys? And I think you've hinted at it already. So if it's just you want to underline that, we can move on. But what are some keys into the future? Because denominations have really, and SBC, Southern Baptists are about as decentralized as you can get. Right? Congregationalist churches, there's not this massive hierarchy or that kind of thing. It's pretty decentralized, but some of the denominations are quite centralized, et cetera, et cetera. Any cues for denominations on how to move forward in a world that is so fractionalized where everyone has access to everyone else's information?
Yeah. Well, it is. The game has changed a lot, and what we needed denominations for 20 years ago, we don't need it, or certainly not 100 years ago. And we need some new wineskins, certainly to think about the right cooperation. What I would encourage people to think about is the value of network and cooperation in the body of Christ. Especially for mega churches, you tend to think, I can just go it alone. And you ends up becoming siloed. That's where heresies grow, because you're not having the right conversations with other leaders. And it really, especially when it comes to overseas stuff, you're not nearly as effective as just being part of a larger body. Tim Keller, who is the Yoda of our generation. I think it's in Center Church, but he says that in Christian history there are movements and there are institutions, and he says they both need each other. He said because an institution without movement is dead. It's just empty. It's empty religiosity. He said, but a movement without institution lacks staying power. And we see this, you and I have both been in ministry long enough to see that somebody will come along and they're the latest, their message is really resonating, and they held a couple big conferences and everybody's talking about them and they're trending on Twitter. But then without the institution behind it, it just tends to, it's like launching a stick of dynamite in the air. It goes off, everybody hears it, but 30 seconds later, there's no evidence anything happened. And so with, in particular, the Southern Baptist Convention, you've got some, whether it's mission boards or educational facilities, at the lowest point in the SBC's history that I remember personally in my lifetime. When I felt like nothing was happening, Southern Baptist seminaries were still putting out into ministry. It was like 4,000 to 5,000, graduates a year who were going into full-time ministry positions. That is staying power, and that meant that when things were at their nadir as a convention, it was still. And so I don't mind giving time to serve. I'm not wed to the institution. It's a tool I'm ready to walk away from if it's no longer profitable. But I think sometimes we can be short-sighted in not seeing that there really is a value in being a part of a network that builds something that has that staying power. Rodney Stark, we've already talked about him. I'll quote him one more time. He said, the single greatest predictor of the future of any movement or denomination is how many young men and women they're raising up for ministry. And so at our lowest point in the SBC, we still had a really good engine for that. And ultimately, that's kind of what, I think has led to a resurgence. And then I know that's a little iffy as to, there's a lot of things right now going on. So I wouldn't say this is an amazing time for Southern Baptist, but I think ultimately, it's something I'm happy to be a part of.
Yeah. You did mention social media, and I was going to ask the question in a different context in terms of the local church, but I think social media really has changed the game for how we talk to each other as leaders and as people on the same journey, on the same mission. Any thoughts on how we can better handle social media, whether that's at the macro level, leader to leader, or congregation to leader, because that seems to be where a lot of the bullets get fired these days.
Yeah. I think in general, those are not great contexts for emotional relationships. I can't remember you probably know it off the top of your head, but they say that whenever you're in an emotionally charged discussion, it's only like 7% of communication is verbal. And then 55% is body language, and the other, whatever delta that is like facial expression, tone of voice. Yeah. And you're deprived of all of that except for that 7%, and it's just, it's not a good forum for engagement. I know that I just, if it feels good for me to tweet it or post it, it probably is not right. That it needs different context. It needs fuller. Yeah. We have a saying for our, our preaching here. We just say no drive-bys in sermons. Mm-hmm. And what we mean by that is I'm not going to take a shot at anything if I don't have, or anything controversial, if I don't have time to really flesh it out. So, take gay marriage. I'm not just going to put that in a list of sins that I just, throw out and move on. I need time to give that context. And so I think on social media, you're like, I'm just not going to do any drive-bys. That's not the forum that's made for that. I do think social media and the online stuff, I think it's really, it's given us, and I love how you talk about this a lot, Carey. It's given us, like the printing press, a whole new lease on sharing the gospel. Being a guy who's very committed to the in-person local church, I'll still say that, one of the things that shifted for us in COVID and that needed to is we used to be a church that kind of had online options. Now, even though we really, the local church is a in-person experience, we also recognize that for most people, their primary way of connection, engagement, maintaining their membership is digital first. It's like, that's the substance of how they connect to our church. And the in-person experience it kind of flows out of that. I'm not rewriting theology there as much as I am just saying practically we've had to center some of those ways of engagement and communication, because that's just how people, they operate now. And if we don't change to that, then we're just, we're just losing audience with them. It's not serving anybody.
In your new book, Essential Christianity, you don't spend a lot of time on it, but you do touch on deconstruction. And I'd love to talk about that. So we talked about a lot of the challenges that the church is facing these days. How does what we're currently seeing in the church tie into deconstruction in your view?
So deconstruction raises some very important and necessary questions that quite honestly need to be asked. I mean, how much, the idea is how much are your beliefs and your institutions and your power structures, how much have they been set up by the powerful to perpetuate the power of the powerful? Now, certainly that conversation can go too far too quickly, but I think there are certain people that are asking, where has the historic institutional, churches in the United States, where have they not only failed to speak prophetically and be more gospel centered than they were culture shaped, it also, it's where have they actually, perpetuated that and embodied that. And there's a lot of people, and every pastor deals with them and can think of faces when I say this, of people who, just have been hurt by the church and have a completely wrong view of who Jesus is and what Christianity is about because of experiences they've had with Christians. That part of deconstruction, those are really healthy conversations. But, it's kind of like C.S. Lewis said, and I actually quote this in the book, where in The Abolition of Man, he said, the purpose of seeing through something is to see what's behind it. It's not just to go on seeing through things forever. And sometimes with deconstruction, it's just this endless kind of, I'm always questioning everything, and there's just really no way for me to know anything, and everything's a power grab, and critical race theory and all the critical theories are just wrapped up in this huge discussion. And I think what I wanted to do with Essential Christianity was say, okay, even though I don't spend a long time on deconstruction, when you see through some of these things, what you see is that the apostles were not, giving first an institution, nor were they giving, first this, really detailed way to live. Those things would grow out of this essential message that answered mankind's deepest questions that are true in the first century and the 21st century. I'd preached the book of Romans for a year. It's where this book came from. And what I did is I pulled out 10 questions that Paul answers in the first 11 chapters of Romans. And then I looked at them and I was like, those are the exact same questions that UNC Chapel Hill students are asking. How do I know there's a God? If there is a God, why doesn't everybody believe in him? That's a question nobody like, it seems like if there were a God, it would just be more obvious. Why do so many people have different opinions? Paul deals with that. Aren't all religions basically the same? He, deals with that in Romans 3 and 4. Then if Christianity is true, then why is it so hard for me? Seems like if it were true, it would just come a lot more naturally. And what about the Christian view of sexuality and these things? And so when I saw those questions as what Paul wanted to say, this is essential gospel truth is the answer to these questions, I thought, well, maybe that would be something that would be helpful for our students here and our young professionals sharing Christ with somebody else. Years ago, I've read this thing Martin Luther said, where he said, never aspire to teach the church at large, just teach your church. And if the church at large feels like you got something to say to it, it'll come to you. So I wrote this book for our church as a tool, and the Good Book Company said, hey, I think this actually could be helpful for others. So that's the book story.
No, and when you're talking about that, it's like, I'm sure 90% of people tend to agree, like completely agree with those are really good questions to answer. And I think if we can just answer those questions, we're all going to be further ahead. I want to ask you a couple more questions before we wrap up. One is, what are the critics of the church right about, in your view?
They are right that a lot of times we've served the interest of power before we've served the gospel. They wouldn't phrase it that way, right. But they have seen that a lot of our institutions were designed to preserve the status quo. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are people that, like you and I talked about earlier, we have a lot of the same idolatry problems and the same flesh problems that everybody else does. What I think they're wrong about is did you ask me what they're wrong about, or just what they're right about?
No, what do you think critics are right about? And then the next question was going to be, what are they wrong about?
Okay, yeah. So what they're wrong about is that a lot of times it's easy for them to attribute our fleshly errors and our historic mistakes to what we believe versus the fact that we all share the same sinful flesh that corrupts basically everything, including the institutions that we lead. That's especially a tragedy in the church, but it's true. I mean, to circle back real quick to abuse, that's one of the really difficult things that you have to show people about abuse is that we, for a long time, evangelical Protestants said, well, that's a Catholic issue. And that's because they don't let priests get married, and that abuse stuff is only them. And listen, I think ideas have consequences. I'm not a fan of celibacy and ministry as a forced thing. So yes, but ideas have consequences. But the issue is any human being in a place of power, unchecked, is going to find ways to manipulate and abuse. And it's just, and when somebody looks at Christians and they say, well, because you believe, in complementarianism, you believe in, leadership that, in the home and in the church, and you recognize this distinction of roles that leads to abuse. You say, well, what's going to happen is you're going to excuse. That's going to make you blind to where it can happen right there where you are. And I think a lot of critics don't realize that what our message has been, and shame on us because we should have said this a lot more clearly. Our message has been that there really is hope only in Christ. And if there's been a redemptive thing at work in our churches, it's that the gospel over time eventually will win out even against our historical, even against our errors and our mistakes, whether it's abuse or in the SBC in particular, just some of their horrendous views on race. Yeah. What you see is that eventually the gospel, the truth of the gospel, won out over that. And what we want to say, what the critics are wrong about is the gospel is the hope of this. The gospel actually, all the things that bother you about our inconsistencies, they're actually addressed in the gospel, and our hope is the gospel, and your hope can be in the gospel too, because that's really the hope that's there for all of us.
Anything else you want to share? Anything else on your mind?
Well, I'm excited about all these things I'm hearing, just little spots of awakening here. When I go back and I read the stories of the awakenings in our country, they always came on a really, really dark, time. And in some ways, Carey, I feel like this is a dark time because of what's happening politically and all the scandal stories in the church. Andy Irwin, who's the producer of the Jesus Revolution movie that came out, he's a friend, and he was just in that movie. He was saying, the hopelessness that most of us, I wasn't even around for it, it was before I was born, but the hopelessness that the Christian community felt in the late 1960s because of the Cultural Revolution. He said I've heard, he said, that it felt as dark as it feels right now, and that's when the Jesus Revolution happened. And I'm just like, man, God, send it again. Is this the time that we're ready for an awakening? If so, I want to be like I'm putting my sail up. I'm ready for the gale force wind.
Well, I'm ready for that moment. I'll tell you that. JD, the book is called Essential Christianity. It's available anywhere you can get books, but where can people track with you these days online?
Yeah. JD Greear, Greear. It's the strangest spelling in the world, I know, but jdgreear.com. It's the easiest place to do it. And I'll try not to angry tweet, so you can follow me at JD Greear on Twitter.
That's great. JD, thanks so much for your time today, and thanks so much for sharing what you shared.
Thanks for having me, Carey.